Mind your own business. My girlfriend said that while standing in our kitchen on a Thursday night. I looked at her, then nodded. Okay. 7 weeks later, she was sitting in her car outside my apartment, asking why I suddenly seemed like a stranger. The truth was simple. I didn't become a stranger. I just stopped chasing someone who had spent months pushing me away. My name is Jake. I'm 33 years old. I work in logistics management. Nothing glamorous, but it pays well. I own my condo. I pay my bills. I show up when I say I will. For most of my adult life, I believed consistency mattered. When I met Alyssa, I thought she believed the same thing. We met through mutual friends, started dating a few months later, and for the first year, things felt easy. Not perfect, just easy. We enjoyed being around each other, made future plans, talked about eventually moving in together. The relationship felt stable, at least on the surface. Looking back, the warning signs arrived much earlier than I admitted. The first red flag was secrecy, not major secrecy, small secrecy. The kind that's easy to excuse. Alyssa hated questions, not accusations, questions, simple questions. What time are you getting home? Later. How much later? I don't know. Or who all is going? People. That was one of her favorite answers. People. Never names, never details, just people. The strange thing was she expected complete transparency from me. If I worked late, she'd ask why. If I met friends, she'd ask who came. If I changed plans, she'd want details. I never minded. Relationships involve communication. At least I thought they did. Apparently, communication only worked in one direction. The second red flag arrived through her best friend, Tara. Tara believed every relationship problem came from men expecting too much. Boundaries were insecurity. Communication was control. Accountability was optional. Every time Alyssa spent a weekend with Tara, she came back with a new complaint, a new grievance, a new reason why she needed more freedom. One Friday night we had dinner with Tara and a few other friends. Halfway through the meal, Tara laughed and pointed at me. Jake would probably apologize if somebody stole his car. Everyone laughed, including Alyssa. Then Tara added, seriously, he lets people get away with everything. Alyssa didn't disagree. She just laughed harder. That moment stayed with me, because people reveal more than they realize when they're joking. The third red flag appeared about 18 months into the relationship. Alyssa became unusually protective of her phone, always face down, always nearby, always locked. Again, I wasn't suspicious. Not at first. What bothered me was how defensive she became whenever the subject came up. One evening I casually asked, "Busy lately?" She immediately frowned. "What does that mean?" "Nothing." "No, seriously." I stared at her, completely confused, because somehow a simple question had turned into a confrontation. Again, that happened often. Questions became accusations. Curiosity became insecurity. Normal conversations became arguments. And somehow I always ended up apologizing. Months passed, and little moments kept piling up. Cancelled plans, last-minute changes, missing details, dismissive comments. None of them seemed relationship-ending, but together they created a pattern where my concerns mattered less and less. The first major conflict happened during a weekend trip we'd planned for months. Nothing expensive, just a short getaway. 3 days before leaving, Alyssa cancelled. Apparently Tara had organized a last-minute girls' trip. Same weekend, same dates. I was disappointed, mostly because she'd already committed. When I mentioned that, she sighed immediately. "Do I need permission now?" There it was, permission. A word she used constantly, even though I never mentioned it. The conversation ended the same way most of our disagreements ended, with me dropping the issue. Not because she was right, because I was tired. About a month later, another name started appearing. Ryan, a co-worker. At first it was harmless. Ryan said something funny. Ryan solved a problem. Ryan recommended a restaurant, normal stuff. People talk about co-workers. Then Ryan started appearing in nearly every work-related story, enough that I eventually joked about it. Ryan gets mentioned a lot. Her reaction was immediate. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" I laughed. "It was a joke. It wasn't funny." Conversation over. Again, I remember sitting there thinking how strange it was. I wasn't allowed to ask questions, wasn't allowed to notice patterns, wasn't allowed to feel uncomfortable. but somehow I was expected to understand everything. Then came the night that changed everything. A Thursday, ordinary evening, ordinary conversation. At least it started that way. Alyssa was getting ready to leave. I was cleaning up after dinner. She grabbed her purse, checked her phone, then headed toward the door. Going somewhere? I asked. Simple question. Normal question. The kind of question couples ask every day. She immediately looked annoyed. Why? No reason. Then why ask? I blinked. Just making conversation. She laughed. Not a happy laugh, an irritated one. Then she looked directly at me and said, Jake, mind your own business for once. The room went completely silent, and for the first time in our relationship, I didn't know what to say. For a few seconds after Alyssa said it, neither of us spoke. Mind your own business for once. The sentence hung in the air, not because it was loud, because it was honest. Sometimes people reveal exactly how they feel when they're frustrated, and for the first time I wasn't sure she saw me as a partner anymore. I nodded slowly. Okay. Then I went back to cleaning the kitchen. That seemed to confuse her. I think she expected an argument, a debate, some kind of reaction. Instead, she left, and I stayed home. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement, just normal conversation, or at least her version of normal. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about the sentence, not because it hurt my feelings, because it revealed something. Partners don't tell each other to mind their own business. Strangers do, roommates do, people protecting territory do, but not partners, at least not healthy ones. A few days later, I decided to test something. Not a game, not a trap, just an observation. I stopped asking questions, completely. No, how was your day? No, who are you meeting? No, what time will you be home? Nothing. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was simply respecting the boundary she'd requested. At first, she didn't notice. Or maybe she enjoyed it. The first week passed quietly. Actually, it felt surprisingly peaceful. No arguments, no defensiveness, no accusations, just silence. Then something interesting happened. The silence started bothering her. One Thursday evening, she came home around 9. Normally, I would have asked how her night went. This time, I looked up from my laptop, smiled, and went back to work. 5 minutes later, she asked, You're not going to ask? I looked up. Ask what? Where I was. I shrugged. You said it wasn't my business. The room became very quiet. She didn't like that answer, not because it was wrong, because it was exactly what she'd asked for. The following week, another strange thing happened. She started volunteering information, random information, unprompted. I had dinner with coworkers. Traffic was terrible. Tara is planning another trip. Every statement felt like bait, like she expected questions to follow, but I didn't ask any. I simply nodded and moved on. The more I respected her boundary, the more frustrated she became. One night she finally snapped. Why are you acting weird? I looked up from the couch. What do you mean? You don't seem interested anymore. The irony was almost unbelievable. For nearly 2 years I'd been told I asked too many questions. Now I wasn't asking enough. I kept my voice calm. I'm just giving you space. She stared at me, then rolled her eyes. The conversation ended there, but something had clearly shifted. For the first time, Alyssa wasn't controlling the emotional rhythm of the relationship, and she didn't like it. A week later, another clue appeared. Not because I was looking for one, because people eventually reveal themselves. I was having lunch with my friend Marcus. Near the end of the meal, he casually asked, How's Alyssa? Fine. Still spending time with that coworker, I frowned. What coworker? Ryan. I sat back. Apparently Marcus had attended a work event through a mutual contact. Apparently he'd seen Alyssa and Ryan there, several times. Again, there was nothing inappropriate, nothing scandalous. The interesting part was that I'd never heard about it, not once, despite hearing plenty about work. I thanked him for the information, then changed the subject, because by then I was starting to realize something. The issue wasn't Ryan. The issue wasn't Tara. The issue wasn't any specific event. The issue was that Alyssa consistently treated information like a privilege, something she could share or withhold depending on convenience. And whenever I noticed, I became the problem. That realization followed me home, and for the first time, I saw the relationship differently. Not as one bad month, not as one argument, as a pattern, a long pattern. one built from hundreds of tiny moments. A few days later, Alyssa showed up at my condo, visibly irritated. She dropped her purse on the counter, then immediately started talking. Apparently, she'd had a bad day, problems at work, drama with friends, stress. Normally, I would have spent an hour listening, offering support, asking questions, trying to help. This time I listened politely, then said, "That sounds frustrating," and went back to reading. She looked stunned. "That's it." I glanced up. "What else would you like me to say?" She stared at me, completely confused, because suddenly she was experiencing what I'd been experiencing for months. Disinterest, emotional distance, minimal effort, and she hated it. The next major conflict happened that weekend. Alyssa wanted to discuss a trip Tara was organizing. Apparently everyone was going. Apparently she'd already committed. Apparently she hadn't mentioned any of it. Again, I simply nodded. "Sounds fun." Her frustration became obvious. "Are you not going to ask any questions?" I smiled slightly. "No, why not?" I held her gaze. "You told me to mind my own business." The room became silent. For a moment she looked almost guilty, almost. Then the defensiveness returned. Immediately, "You're being passive-aggressive." "No. Yes, you are." I shook my head. "I'm respecting what you asked for." She hated that answer, because there was no argument to win, no accusation to reverse, no insecurity to attack, just her own words and her own consequences. 3 days later, she finally said the thing she'd been building toward for weeks. The thing that changed everything. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, neither of us talking much. The relationship felt different, not angry, empty. Eventually, Alyssa crossed her arms and said, "You know what? Maybe we're just not compatible anymore." There it was, the ultimatum, the threat, the sentence designed to make me chase, to make me reassure, to make me fight for the relationship. 6 months earlier, I would have done exactly that. Instead, I nodded, then calmly said, "Okay." The color immediately drained from her face, and for the first time since she told me to mind my own business, Alyssa looked genuinely nervous. When I said, "Okay," Alyssa looked completely caught off guard. Not angry, not offended, confused, like she'd expected a completely different conversation. For nearly 2 years, every major disagreement followed the same pattern. She pulled away. I moved closer. She got defensive. I explained. She threatened distance. I reassured her. The cycle always ended with me doing the work. This time it didn't, and she noticed immediately. "What do you mean, okay?" I shrugged. "If that's how you feel." "That's not what I meant." I nodded. Maybe not, but it was what she'd said. And for the first time, I wasn't interested in translating her words into something easier to accept. The conversation ended awkwardly. She left shortly afterward, and I sat alone in my condo feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Relief, not happiness, not satisfaction, relief, because the constant tension had finally broken. Over the next week, Alyssa's behavior changed dramatically, almost overnight. Suddenly, she wanted conversations. Suddenly, she wanted attention. Suddenly, she wanted explanations. The same things she'd spent months treating as unreasonable. One evening, she texted, "What are you doing tonight?" I replied, "Reading." A minute later, "That's it." I smiled at my phone, because she was finally experiencing something she'd been creating for a long time. Distance. The next few days followed the same pattern. More texts, more calls, more questions. Meanwhile, I stayed polite, respectful, calm, but emotionally detached. And the more detached I became, the more uncomfortable she looked. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the relationship's direction. Reality was. A week later came Karma Wave 1. Practical consequences. The lease on Alyssa's apartment was ending soon. For months we discussed moving in together, not officially, but seriously. The plan had always been there. Now it wasn't. One evening she brought it up. "So, what are we doing about living arrangements?" I looked at her, then answered honestly, "I don't think we should move in together." The silence was immediate. Her eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Yeah," for the first time. The consequences became real, not emotional, practical. She wasn't losing arguments. She was losing assumptions. The assumption that I'd always be available. The assumption that I'd always wait. The assumption that nothing would actually change. That conversation hit her hard, harder than I expected. A few days later she called me crying, not dramatically, just genuinely upset. "I don't understand what's happening." I listened quietly, then answered honestly, I think you do, because deep down I believed she did. The following week brought karma wave 2, the social consequences, and like most real consequences, they arrived naturally, not through revenge, not through exposure, through reality. Mutual friends started noticing something was wrong. People asked questions, people compared stories, people observed, and eventually the pattern became visible, not because I told them, because they'd watched it happen. One of those people was Tara. Ironically, the same Tara who spent years encouraging Alyssa to demand more freedom, more independence, more space. Apparently Tara's advice sounded much better before actual consequences appeared. One evening Marcus called me. Did Alyssa tell you what happened? No. She got into an argument with Tara. That surprised me. Those two agreed about almost everything. What about? Marcus laughed softly. Apparently Tara told her she pushed too hard. I sat quietly for a moment, because that was the first time I'd heard anyone say it out loud. Pushed too hard, not cheated, not betrayed, not committed some huge dramatic act, just pushed a good relationship further and further until it finally broke. The truth is usually less dramatic than people expect. A few days later, Alyssa asked if we could meet. I agreed. We met at a small coffee shop we'd visited dozens of times together. The moment she sat down, I noticed something different. No defensiveness, no attitude, no irritation, just sadness. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she finally asked, Are you really done? The question sounded much heavier than the words themselves. I took a breath, then answered honestly, I think so. Her eyes immediately filled with tears, not manipulative tears, not strategic tears, real ones. The kind people cry when reality finally catches up. What happened to us? For a moment I didn't answer, because the truth was bigger than one conversation, bigger than one mistake, bigger than one argument. Eventually I said, it wasn't one thing. She looked down, then nodded slowly, because she already knew. I talked about the constant defensiveness, the dismissive comments, the double standards, the way normal communication slowly became unacceptable. The way every concern somehow became evidence that I was doing something wrong. Most importantly, I talked about respect, or the lack of it, because that's what this was always about. Not Ryan, not Tara, not trips, not plans, respect. The simple act of treating your partner like they matter. For a long time, Alyssa listened without interrupting. Then she said something I'll never forget. I thought you'd always put up with it. The honesty stunned me, not because it was cruel. Because it was true, she genuinely believed I'd never leave, that I'd always absorb disappointment, always compromise, always understand, always stay. And eventually that certainty made her careless. That's what happens sometimes. People stop protecting things they think they can't lose. Then came karma wave 3, the emotional consequence. The hardest one, regret, not immediate regret, the slow kind. The kind that arrives weeks later, months later. The kind that shows up when the noise disappears and you're finally left alone with your choices. Alyssa and I officially ended things shortly afterward. No screaming, no dramatic confrontation, no revenge, just acceptance. The relationship had been ending for months. We were simply acknowledging it. The year that followed became one of the most peaceful years of my life. I focused on work, got promoted, started traveling more, spent time with family, reconnected with old friends. Most importantly, I stopped feeling responsible for someone else's emotional comfort. And that changed everything. About 11 months later, I ran into Alyssa unexpectedly. Bookstore, Saturday afternoon. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just two people catching up. Before leaving, she smiled sadly and said, You know what the worst part is? What? She looked away for a second, then laughed softly. I kept thinking you were being difficult. I smiled. Yeah. And now I realize you were asking for normal things. I nodded, because that was exactly it. Normal things. Communication, consideration, respect, nothing extraordinary. Nothing unreasonable. As I watched her walk away, I realized something. The relationship didn't end because she told me to mind my own business. It didn't end because of one argument or one bad week or one conversation. It ended because of hundreds of small choices, hundreds of moments where respect became optional, hundreds of times consideration was replaced by convenience. That sentence didn't destroy the relationship. It simply revealed a problem that had been growing for a very long time, and once I finally saw it clearly, I stopped chasing. That's when everything changed.